Hi everyone. Thank you so much for having me here to guest lecture for you today. My name is Kelly Sutherland. I'm currently a doctoral candidate in applied psychology and prevention science at the University of Massachusetts in Lowell, Massachusetts. I think that these opportunities are really wonderful for students like myself. I remember taking my first research methods course. I was an undergraduate student at Hofstra University, and I really thought that statistics and research methodology were just not my thing, and I wanted to be done with them until I had a very talented professor named Dr. Michael Barnes. He, similarly to your professor, introduced research in a very approachable and hands on way through current research. That was 11 years ago now, and I have my master's degree in experimental psychology, and I'm wrapping up my doctoral degree now. Um, my main line of research focuses on wrongful convictions and how we can prevent them when so many people give up their right to a jury trial. Let's dive in. Albert Alschuler, who is a renowned criminal law researcher, commented that the United States has created a nearly perfect system for convicting the innocent. And it can be hard to understand why he would say this when the United States prides itself on, quote, innocent until proven guilty and providing protections for defendants facing trial. However, many Americans don't realize that the majority of criminal cases are resolved through guilty pleas. In fact, 97.6% of federal criminal cases were resolved through guilty pleas in 2019. And of these convictions, 75% were secured through plea bargaining, which is an exchange of leniency for an admission of guilt by the defendant. So, this means that only 2.4% of defendants exercised their constitutional right to a trial last year. And on its own, for most people, the statistic might not be alarming. However, recent data has revealed that 18% of exonerees have falsely pled guilty. This means that 18% of wrongful conviction cases, the defendant pled guilty and accepted responsibility for a crime that they did not commit. My career goals really focus on reducing the number of people who are wrongfully convicted through pleading guilty, but that's going to take some extraordinary criminal justice reform. And in the meantime, I'm focused on how defendants who plead guilty are perceived. So, I'm going to walk you through one of my latest studies in which I explored perceptions of innocence in defendants who pled guilty and defendants who were convicted at trial. It's well known that plea bargaining is viewed negatively by lay people. Judd Rakoff, a federal district judge, has even lamented that guilty defendants are able to avoid the full force of the law. The research into perceptions of the plea bargaining process reveal that the public's thoughts about the process really focus on the why. Why did the defendants engage in plea bargaining? What sentence were they facing at trial? What sentence did they receive for pleading? Sentences that exclude incarceration or jail time, such as those for time served or for probation, were viewed as a reward for the defendant. And because such little research exists on defendants who falsely plead guilty, I base most of my work on defendants who falsely confess. It's known in the criminal psych literature that the public views guilty pleas as a variant of voluntary confessions. Both include an admission of guilt for the alleged crime and acceptance of responsibility, often, which is important when determining sentencing. However, we know that dispositional factors such as a person's age, education, and race, and situational factors such as pretrial detention, the sentence faced at trial, and the sentence offered in exchange for the plea, these factors really work together to increase the risk that an innocent person will plead guilty. Prior research has experimentally demonstrated a series of negative judgments that happen when people learn about an exoneree's false confession. These defendants are seen as lacking intelligence, suffering from mental health issues, being not entirely innocent despite being exonerated, and being less deserving of government aid. A couple of researchers also replicated these findings and demonstrated that those who falsely confess are even seen as less deserving of financial compensation. And the original researcher in this study extended these findings to those who falsely pled guilty. Now, all of this research has focused on exonerees and how we perceive them, but what about the large number of defendants who plead guilty and are unable to overturn their conviction? Do we still think negatively of them, or do we sort of understand the system at hand? Would the negative perceptions be of the same magnitude? We would guess that those who are not exonerated may face even harsher judgments than those who are. So, my research will take a couple experiments to flesh out, and I'm using it as my doctoral dissertation. But I began by simply exploring whether defendants who were convicted at trial and defendants who were convicted through a guilty plea were perceived differently. So, these perceptions of guilt are relevant for job applications, housing, government benefits. There's really a lot that comes with a criminal conviction in the United States, and unfortunately, millions of people have criminal convictions that are not of their own doing. So, we predicted that defendants who were convicted by pleading guilty would be perceived as less likely to be factually innocent than defendants who were convicted at trial. I'm going to walk you through the method just so you can see exactly what was going on. So participants for this study were recruited through Mechanical Turk, which is an Amazon data collection website. It's now been overhauled and is called something different, which I'm not exactly sure what. But our only prerequisite was that participants were residents of the United States, as the prevalence, of guilty pleas is somewhat unique here. So we recruited 362 participants, with approximately 43% women and 23% non-white participants. And on average, participants were around 38 years old. The majority reported having no prior knowledge of the criminal justice system. And it's important for me to acknowledge that this sample is not representative of the United States, especially in ethnicity. For future studies, it would be best if I recruited a representative sample, and that's really what I'm looking to do with my dissertation work, because I think that if we're going to talk about how Americans perceive other Americans, we should really have a representative sample at hand. Participants were asked to read 10 crime vignettes. So, as an example, here is the drug trafficking vignette, as I call it. All of them were written by myself, and we pilot tested many more of these before this study to make sure that none were too different from each other on our outcome measure of interest. So just to quickly go through it, every vignette looked like this. There was a charge. The defendant was charged with drug trafficking. Details: police observed the defendant participating in a suspicious transaction on a street corner. When approached by police, the second party fled. Although no drugs were found, the defendant was in possession of a large amount of cash. And so you'll notice that in these details, we shied away from anything that gave details regarding gender, ethnicity, race, things that were identifying and could be used to make stereotypical or biased conclusions. And then each vignette had an outcome that either said the defendant pleaded guilty to this crime, or the defendant was found guilty of this crime at trial. The 10 vignettes were randomized for each participant, and then the 10 outcomes, half of which stated the defendant pleaded guilty to this crime, and half of which stated the defendant was found guilty of this crime, were also randomized. This created a unique combination of vignettes and outcomes for each participant. So we know that it will be unique for each participant, but we'll be able to make overall generalized conclusions, which is exactly what we're looking for. After reading each of these vignettes, the participants were asked a series of questions, and of most importance, participants were asked, what is the likelihood that the defendant was actually innocent of the crime? And now let's walk through some results. Because of the randomization of vignettes and outcomes, I used a fairly complex type of statistical test called the linear mixed effects model. This controls for variability in the participants and in the vignette order, but as this is just an introductory research methods course, I really think that we can shy away from getting too deep into the details there. What we do see here is that there's a significant difference between judgments of potential wrongful convictions in guilty pleas and in trial verdicts. So individuals see trial convictions as more likely to produce a wrongful conviction than a guilty plea, regardless of what vignette they saw. And interestingly, we also asked participants a very straightforward question about wrongful conviction potentials. The questions that they were asked: what is the likelihood that a defendant who is convicted of a criminal offense at trial is actually innocent? And what is the likelihood that a defendant who pleads guilty to a criminal offense is actually innocent? And participants were asked this question after they had seen the vignettes and after they had made their judgments that you saw on the previous slide. And I just used a simple paired t-test to see if individuals personally and consciously believed that trial convictions and guilty plea convictions were different in any way. And this question and these statistics demonstrate that individuals don't recognize their own cognitive biases towards defendants who plead guilty, as there was no statistical difference in these self-reported judgments. My second study in this series uses 8 of the 10 vignettes. 2 will end in trial conviction, 2 end in a plea conviction, just as in this current study, but the remaining 4 give details of the plea bargain that was offered to the defendant, with 2 of them being coercive pleas. So this study will allow me to determine if people can recognize the situational pressure that defendants face simply by giving them details of the plea deal. And the third study in this series will partially depend on the results of the second study, but if judgments of innocence are still uneven between trial and pleas, I'll explore whether explicitly stating that the defendant faced a coercive plea deal helps to alleviate perceptual errors. If you have any questions or comments, please feel free to email me. I'm so excited and grateful for this opportunity to share my research, and good luck on your journey with Dr. Russell. Thank you.